Welcome to Revolutionary Optimism. Issues like economic hardship, a teetering democracy, and the worsening climate emergency have left many Americans feeling more despair than ever. Fortunately, physician, humanitarian, and social justice advocate Dr. Paul Zeitz has identified revolutionary optimism as a new cure for that hopelessness and cynicism. Once you commit yourself as a revolutionary optimist, you can bravely unleash your personal power, #unify with others, and accelerate action for repair, justice, and peace. On this podcast, Dr. Zeitz is working to provide you with perspectives from leaders fighting for equity, justice, and peace on their strategies for overcoming adversity and driving forward revolutionary transformation with optimism. In this episode, Dr. Zeitz is talking with Susan Sturm. Susan Sturm is the George M. Jaffin Professor of Law and Social Responsibility at Columbia Law School. Susan is a renowned legal scholar, educator, and changemaker. She's the founding director of the Center for Institutional and Social Change and co-author of Who's Qualified, a new democracy forum on the future of affirmative action, written with the legendary Lainey Guinier. Her newest book, What Might Be? Confronting Racism to Transform Our Institutions, released by Princeton University Press, offers a bold invitation to rethink how we confront racism, not with despair, but with creative, collective transformation. Susan collaborates across sectors, from law and education to art and community, to build a culture of participation, equity, and repair. Here's your host, Dr. Paul Zeitz.
Welcome, Susan. It's so great to have you on the podcast. What an honor.
It's an honor for me to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for your life's work and your commitment to racial equity and racial justice. And I'm so honored to have the opportunity to have read your latest book, What Might Be? Confronting Racism to Transform Our Institutions. I was struck that it came out in 2025, a year where we're seeing quite a tidal wave of progress, I would say, towards racial equity. But before we get into all that, I wanted to start from your beginning. If you could give us a bit of your history and your personal journey about what sparked your personal passion for this kind of institutional racial transformation.
It's so good to start with what brings you into the work, because that's what keeps you in the work, right? So I really appreciate the question. I would say my interest in racial justice and equity and institutional change started in my family in a way that I wasn't really aware of at the time. But I grew up in a family that had contradictions built right into the fiber of life in my family. I lived in a loving family with music and good food and enough to eat, and an abusive mother who was also a loving mother. And I had to learn how to navigate the contradiction between what she said our family was, which was this ideal, perfect family of love and music and admiration, and the often day-to-day realities of experiencing a kind of emotional violence and occasionally physical. So how did I navigate that? I felt my own survival really depended upon how I could figure out how to say it doesn't have to be this way, and how I could close that contradiction. I also experienced some contradictions directly around race and social justice. My father spent 6 weeks in Dachau as an 18-year-old. We spoke every year on Passover about freedom. My parents talked about racial justice, and I experienced a lot of, I would say, racial hierarchy and discrimination with the people who were Black in our lives as people who always appeared in more servant-like positions. And I really had to try to navigate these kinds of contradictions. And so for me, pursuing a way to close the gap between what we say we do and what we actually do was initially a question of survival, and then lifelong a question of meaning making. And I would say that this need to navigate my own experience of trauma and its relationship to racial justice has both kept me connected and motivated in the work, and also sometimes gotten me into some trouble because I could confuse my own needs as a person who cares about these issues, as a white woman, as a person in a position of power, as I know that I am as a faculty member at Columbia Law School, and the people I was working to help advance racial equity with.
Powerful, powerful story. In our prep call, I remember we talked about caste and caste systems and how the correlation between the actions of the Nazi government in creating a caste system over Jews and homosexuals and gypsies and other groups that they identified and then targeted for extermination. And we talked about how the racial caste system operates in our country. And so your upbringing was kind of a kaleidoscope of all that. But if you could explain your views on caste and caste system, we've talked about it on the show in the past, and how you see the opportunity to heal from caste,
Yes.
how you think about that.
Well, when we think about racism or any classification that places one group over another and makes it possible for the dominant group to advance its interests by subjugating or exploiting the dominated group, we're really talking about power.
Right.
We're really talking about the exercise of power by one group over another in a kind of scarcity mindset, in a situation where the dominant group views its own well-being, its own sense of their own value in relation to extracting from or dominating another group. And that is really the meaning of caste in a lot of ways, is creating that kind of hierarchical structure that enables a group with power, whether it's economic power, political power, cultural power, to use that power in a way that dehumanizes the status and experiences of another group. So when we talk about racism, with people thinking, well, I am not the group that is being subjugated, I think it's really important to understand that the ability to dehumanize a group, any group of people, and the assumption that the way one group prospers is at the expense of another is a recipe for the lack of freedom and for the dehumanization of everyone.
Right. So moving to your book, What Might Be, Confronting Racism to Transform Our Institutions, I want to just bring you to chapter 1. There was an important sentence there that touches on these issues about the U.S. Constitution, which I found really helpful in articulating something that I understood, but this says it so clearly. You say, the U.S. Constitution codified the opposing tenets of freedom and slavery, equality and exclusion, democracy and disenfranchisement. And I thought that was a really, you talked about holding the paradoxes of your childhood. And I think this sentence really brought me to clarity on the paradox that I feel many Americans feel about, like, attachment or honoring something about our country. At least we were educated that way. And it was the equality and the freedom part of it. And then the reality of it also codified these other disenfranchisement and caste. It created a caste system. So I want to ask you if you agree with that. And also, that was written 238 years ago or so. So I want to come back into the present and go into the future from that as a launching point.
That sentence that you quoted is part of explaining one of the three paradoxes that I identify in that chapter 1, which is the paradox of racialized institutions. And the institution that we're talking about there is the institution of law. And I am someone who went to law school because I wanted to pursue justice and was immediately hit in the face with the fact that the very tool that I was hoping to use to advance justice was a tool that was actually maintaining racial injustice. And that was true from the very founding, as you just read, of our government, that at the time the Constitution was adopted, the Constitution itself permitted and enshrined the enslavement of people at the same time that it declared these principles that were true for a subset of people, for a group of white men who had property. And so there was this tension that was built in from the very beginning of our government. And that tension remains in place to this very day, that the very instruments that we must rely on to pursue justice, we use the law, we use the courts to hold people accountable to principles of democracy, to principles of racial justice. And at the same time, our legal system disproportionately targets people of color. Our legal system continues to protect the interests of those who have at the expense of those who do not, and in ways that the legal doctrine sometimes enshrines, and that even if the law says everyone should be treated equally, because access to justice depends upon access to resources, to fair and unbiased treatment, those same institutions are themselves practicing the very racism that the Constitution says that courts and the justice system are supposed to eliminate. So there's this contradiction. We have to both rely on justice, so-called justice institutions, while we also need to challenge them and question them and hold them accountable for their own failure to pursue the values that really underlie equal justice for all.
Those paradoxes are ever present. The paradox of racialized institutions, as you said. And your work, you go into great depth about how people come together, just regular people, and they come to an understanding of their different experiences, their different frameworks, and then they negotiate a way forward to kind of equalize the playing field, I guess is a quick way of saying it. I want to, before we get into, so I do want to get into your work about the legal and court system, I think is a thread here. But I do want to note for our listeners that this is being recorded right after July 4th, 2025, where we celebrated our 249th birthday or anniversary of our country. And we're fast approaching the 250th anniversary, which is a major moment, we believe. So I'd like to ask you, I just noticed that you published an op-ed in The Guardian with some other colleagues. Can you give us the message that you are trying to communicate in The Guardian?
Happily, I would be very thrilled to do that. And I was able to publish this opinion piece with two other people, Deborah Archer, who is the president of the ACLU, and Song Richardson, who is a former dean of a law school and president of a college. We come from different racial backgrounds, different experiences and different roles, but came together around the idea that July 4th rings hollow this year, as it has really every year for many people of color, because of that paradox of racialized institutions, because the declaration of the 4th of July and of independence happened at a time when there were many people who weren't free, as Frederick Douglass pointed out on July 5th. at a time when people remained enslaved.
Right.
And we wrote this with the idea that, yes, right now, the idea of a racial democracy, a democracy in which people, regardless of their race or background or sex or sexual orientation, or political persuasion or religion, that everyone can experience themselves as full participants of their communities, of their governments, that is really threatened in a way that I would say has not been the case in my lifetime, in the way that it is now.
Mm-hmm.
And we experience a celebration of freedom as really a paradox. We're celebrating something that we identify with as a nation, that's part of who we are, and that many people experience as under really profound threat right now. And everyone we know is experiencing this in some way or another that is personally threatening, and yet people feel, many, personally paralyzed. What can we do at a time when these decisions to limit even our ability to speak about race, let alone address racism, is coming from the highest levels of government?
Right.
And so one of the things we talk about in this op-ed is the importance of everyday people practicing democracy where they live, where they work, where they worship, where they go to school, and then finding each other across communities, so that we, first of all, don't forget what democracy looks like and feels like. So we build the kind of muscle that maybe we haven't been exercising in the way that we need to for many decades and maybe centuries, where everyday people should be engaged, and that the political system often disenfranchises. And we cannot rely, we say democracy is not a spectator sport. We cannot rely only on our elected representatives, because the institutions they are a part of have to be recreated and reimagined. And we, as the people who are affected by those institutions, are the ones who need to push that forward. So we identify everyday people, like students of mine at Columbia Law School, who started an engagement project in Harlem and Queens to enable the students and citizens of those communities to speak up at the local level, to understand their government so they can act on behalf of themselves. We identify some projects in Chicago where people in communities that are segregated and they recognize are experiencing very different forms of services come together and push for change. Identify a project in Indiana where a community has really pushed to deal with a problem created by where the highways were located, decimating communities of color, to rebuild those kinds of connections. And then all of these are things that if we do them now in a way that allows us to say we still can influence change, and then we come together and say, how can we push for this so that people will want to vote, that people will want to transform the political parties, so people will want to get involved at the highest levels of government, then we can push back. So claiming this idea of, you would call it radical optimism or revolutionary optimism. I would call it hope, because I'm not sure I'm optimistic, but I'm definitely hopeful.
Well, that counts.
And so doing a practice that builds these relationships that we wouldn't otherwise have with people who are different from ourselves, not only by race, but also by class, by educational level, by political affiliation even, but people who actually care about people, who care about people being treated fairly, who care about having policies and practices at every level that are oriented around those kinds of values, that we can then have an impact, which we're seeing in very small places, but in places that I think can accumulate. I'm seeing a kind of activism under the radar screen that accompanies fear of speaking publicly. And so we can and must continue to act. And those of us, I count myself in this position, who are safer than others. I am not someone whose faces deportation. I am not someone who can easily be fired. I am not someone who will starve. I have to be willing to step up. And people like me need to be willing to take risks and to stand in for the people who feel the same way, but for whom taking action or speaking out would have potentially life-threatening or untenable consequences.
Yeah, yeah. Beautiful. And what a profound call to action on and around July 4th. And I think we're so aligned on this quest to awaken the potential of citizen engagement and citizen participation that is so urgently needed right now. I think you offered another insight here, which is I want to lift a little bit. I think you were saying that while the political forces are trying to suppress even a conversation or institutionalization of efforts to heal the wounds of racial caste, and that has created a lot of fear and inhibition on the one hand, and on the other hand, there is a countercurrent that's happening privately that could be revolutionary, because I'm hoping that people are going to get to a point that those little ripples of transformation that you talk about in your book are going to get to a place where people say enough is enough. We're not going to put up with this. Do we want to go through another 10, 20, 40 years of Jim Crow on the ascent where people are racially oppressed? I don't think we should choose that. I think we should choose another pathway. And that's what Unify USA and a lot of the movements out there are working on. There's a lot of resistance and blocking what's happening. And that's happening on the streets. It's happening in the legal system. It's happening through the courts to a certain extent. Congress should be playing that role, but they're not. So that's gone. The courts are overwhelmed and moving slow. And so many experts have agreed to end up where you start, which is the powers in the people. And the people have to take this on at the local, interpersonal level, and also systemically. So I'm excited about your analysis and what you put out there on July 4th. That's really important. I wanted to ask you to build on this question about, we often hear that the system is broken, and your work suggests about reimagining the system. As a legal expert, if I can give you a magic wand and you could imagine what a refreshed constitution would look like, where we would be healing from caste, and we would be creating new constitutional framework for living together as one people, living and supporting peaceful coexistence and resilience so that we can be interdependent. Actually, I think the notion that we're independent, could you talk about interdependence and how we could articulate that in our Constitution?
Let me start by talking about the notion of interdependence and then move to the question of what's the role of the Constitution and the law in supporting that interdependence. Is that okay?
Perfect.
With you? Yeah. Great. So in the book, I talk about the idea of linked fate. And that idea is not a language that I came up with. It's a language that was articulated in a book called Behind the Mule, that is by a political scientist, that was originally described by Dawson to characterize the interests of Black people who are very different from each other. Why is it that wealthy Black people, educated Black people from the North, identify with the interests of people who are very different from them in every way other than their race? And he identified that people felt like what happens to one affects all of us. And that was because of the way Black people are viewed and treated in our society. I take that very powerful idea of linked fate and now apply it in a multiracial way to say, how is it that people who on the surface, if you have a scarcity mindset, look like their interests are opposed. But actually, if you think about the well-being of the planet, of the survival of rule of law and our democracy, if you look at environmental justice and climate change, if you look at so many issues, we cannot actually prosper, whatever our race, if we don't think about what my dear friend and colleague Lonnie Guinier called the miner's canary. How does the experience of the people who are most oppressed in our society actually signal ways in which our institutions are toxic for everyone? So by really exploring in a meaningful way our linked fate, the ways in which if we allow a government to divide us by using race as a way to instill fear and as a way to deflect attention from the people who, the very small group of people who are benefiting by oppressing everybody else, that if we identify that dynamic as something that affects all of us, that our fates are linked in that we have to change the way power is exercised. We have to change the way in which rule of law is respected for everyone, and that we can do that by attending also to the ways in which those who are most marginalized and most oppressed in our society, which include people of color, are affected. Then we can come together around shared interests. And we see that happening in some communities, even between police and communities who recognize that violence is affecting everyone in ways that are really problematic. That's rare, but it does happen. We see it in the theater industry, where people of color came together around the No More 10 out of 12 and linked with women and first generation actors and people come from less privileged backgrounds who are being driven out of the theater industry by the conditions requiring you to work round the clock. I can keep going. There are examples of where people have come together, and we're seeing it now around threats to our democracy and to our court system, that the willingness to treat people who have been treated as outside the circle of concern so really in such dehumanizing ways has meant that the court system dehumanizes everyone. So what does it look like to say we need to transform the system with the idea that everyone should fully participate? And we have to ask the question, who is and who is not fully participating? And what do we need to do not to change them, not to change only individuals who are treating them badly, but to change the conditions and the settings? So that's the context for interdependence. That's the context for really, this is a rigorous practice of identifying linked fate, which you can do in any community, in any institution, in any polity, if you get a group of people who are willing to be serious and rigorous about what's actually happening in their institutions. So what would it look like then to have that practice of doing that kind of inquiry enshrined in our Constitution? What would it mean to take the Declaration of Independence, the principles that are articulated there, and make them the guideposts for government practice? So if I could reimagine our Constitution, there's a lot I would want to keep. Yeah, I really would want to keep concerns and the value of equality reflected in the 5th and 14th Amendment. I would want to keep the value of freedom of expression reflected in the First Amendment, and due process, and the need for checks and balances, and all of those things that are built into our constitutional structure. But I would move away from the idea that only formal equality is enough. That if you say you're doing it, even if you're not really doing it, that you are then no longer vulnerable. And I would say we need to have a set of institutions that encourage and push people who are in institutions at the local level to be able to ask the question, who is and who is not fully participating.
Right.
And the role of the courts would be to encourage that kind of deliberative democracy at the local level, and to step in when there are serious abuses, to basically create the guardrails for our democracy. And we have the structure there. It's just a question of having the will to implement it in a way that can overcome our history of racialized institutions operating alongside their values of justice.
Yeah, so that paradox, like what you're saying sounds so smart and logical. And then as I'm listening to you, my heart opens. And then I also go, oh my God, but look at the news. It's the complete opposite of what you're saying is being reversed. There's like racialized oppression being, channeled by the entire federal government. And even progress that was made in the last decade or even decades is being reversed as well by the Supreme Court, by the executive branch right now, and now the legislative branch. So we seem to have, I think we've lost our mooring, and we're in a situation of this paradox that you've been talking about seems to be getting worse, not better.
Well, the paradox is there, and I guess the worry is that it will move from a paradox to a permanent prevalence of one side of the paradox, right? That of the racism. What I will say, and I think, how do we move forward? That's implicit in your question is the follow-up question. How do we move forward at a time when everything seems to be working against a struggle toward justice, and it seems to be moving toward, an authoritarian imposition of a racial hierarchy, which harkens back to another time in our history, but doesn't even own up to it. In that way, makes it in some ways even more insidious and harder. I will say that in part because I learned very early on in my career that we cannot rely only or even largely on the law as the front runner, as the leading edge of justice, that law can support, but law follows rather than leads the will of movements of people. And that has always been the case. The Civil Rights Acts only followed the civil rights movement. Every type of change that we have seen that has ever gotten enshrined in the law, same-sex marriage, followed a movement of people that were willing to come together and first experience those values on a local level. We saw this in the freedom schools in the 60s. We saw this in so many local communities around LGBTQ rights. Before that found its way, before those values of justice and equity and fairness found their way into any kind of legal principle. So I've never thought that the law was going to make things happen. Now we have a situation where people who have control over the legal levers can push against change. That has been true at other times in our history. And so what I think is really important is that we see this situation, which I find so potentially despairing, is also the opening for us to do what we haven't done in my lifetime, which is to really create genuine participatory democracy that then pushes for this kind of change and then can become a movement that can push back against what we are seeing at the highest levels of government. And that if we don't allow the repression to drive us out of this work, it might drive us underground, in some places where it's too dangerous to be completely public. But if we continue to, in our everyday lives, create the world, we have a memory, unlike some other points in time, we have a recent memory, at least some of us, of what this democracy tastes like, feels like, looks like, can do. We need to make that real for more people through the work we do, and then build out the connections across these local communities, which we cannot rely on the federal government to do. But there's state governments, some state governments that are still staying in the work.
Yeah.
And then there are a lot of organizing forces like yours, right?
Right.
Like yours, that are can't substitute for the power of the federal government. I don't want to be naive about this. This is
Right.
I can't say we're going to succeed, but if we don't try, we will definitely fail. And what is it that Gandhi says? Something is absolutely impossible until it happens.
Yes.
Right. And so this seems impossible under the current system.
Right.
But we cannot succumb to that. What is it that we say in our op-ed? Despair is not a strategy.
Right.
That we cannot succumb to that. And that by doing this work with people who share our values, we can experience right now the opposite of despair. We can experience hope on a small scale. And then ramp up our efforts. I mean, I'm doing things I've never done before because I feel compelled to act beyond my own classroom, beyond my own scholarship, beyond my own workshop,
Right.
because we can't afford to only stay local at a time like this. And I am so not alone.
Right.
There are so many other people who feel the necessity of taking action, caring for yourself and your family, which I believe is always a first step,
right?
But in a way that connects. So that's where the hope lies. And I don't think it's impossible. Do I think it's likely? I'm not going to predict, but I think it's critical that we act as if it will happen, because then it might happen.
Exactly. Well said. So much wisdom in that sharing. The point you made about movements are what changes reality rather than the legal system or laws. They tend to follow the movements that we co-create. So I think that's a call. That was very important clarity. And it's also a call to action in a way. I think that was really super important. In terms of the moment that we're in, one of the really challenging things that I have found, we see the current government and the Project 2025 movement is what I'm calling it. They're separating us and dividing us. We've talked about the racial rhetoric and the racial opposition. I mean, the rhetorical and actually action against DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which had become really prominent in our culture and in our society from 2020 when George Floyd was murdered until 2025. But then we're also seeing the othering of people of color who are immigrants. And we're seeing the othering of that play out globally, like with the travel bans to predominantly Black and Muslim countries. It's everywhere. So can you unpack that a little bit about, I had an interesting experience in California last week. I was meeting with a woman of color who was kind of aligned with the MAGA movements, like it's time to get rid of the immigrants. And one of the reasons that she cited her feeling that way was because the Latino delegation in the California state legislature opposed the effort by the state legislator to pass a reparations commission, to establish a reparations commission. So she felt betrayed by the Latino community, and that it got interpreted as her opposition to, or her support for what was happening with the ICE raids out in LA. And I just was like, oh, that was a tough conversation for me.
I can imagine that that would be a tough conversation. And it is part of what I think is the intention of this range of relentless, unpredictable activity against different groups, is to instill this kind of fear and resentment that gets people who have actually very aligned interests to work at cross purposes. I think that the fact that the actions that are being taken at the federal level are having so much negative impact on so many people, including people who voted for Trump and who supported the MAGA movement's rhetoric, I think that reality opens up one set of possibilities. That one way that people's interests who see themselves as opposed in the short run get identified in a more long-term collaborative way is when some crisis happens, when some really terrible shock happens that forces people to say, wait a minute, this isn't what I thought. And, I have a sense that that could be coming with the cuts in Medicaid, with the ways in which people who thought they were safe until their family member was targeted for deportation, that the breadth of the action, I think, is, I can't say that I invite it, but I think it will take one step toward making it at least more fertile ground to explore the possibilities of these connections. But I also think that because our political institutions and our public discourse have become so polarized that when our ways of forming our views about other people come only through those institutions, it's almost predictable that people will be willing to throw one group or another under the bus. Because if it's not them, it will be me, is the mindset. So I think it's so important to create opportunities for people who might even see themselves as at cross purposes or as enemies, to have opportunities where there isn't a specific policy that you have to vote on, but where there is a longer term question that people can come together around, to be in the same space with each other. That and to have that happen in a way that makes it possible to step out of the overdetermined toxicity and polarization of our current institutions. And that's why opportunities that are not only defined by political party or by the short-term vote on an issue are really important. And those occasions are going to be developed by communities around concrete opportunities to come together and provide care, to provide well-being, to support our educational institutions, et cetera. Is that going to counteract what you just described? Not usually, but the idea is that you create these different localities where this does happen, where they can connect. I don't think anyone likes being in a situation where they're experiencing fear, scarcity, resentment. Is a terrible place to be. And so if we create opportunities for people to come together in these other ways, I think that is the way in which we can potentially move against. And there are occasional openings like that in the political arena, and those have to be the models when we see that happening at the local level. When we see that happening among the politicians who manage to resist this kind of polarization, then those are the people that we need to come together around.
Yeah, well said. And I think there is a civic renewal movement afoot, and there are people at the local level and state level and at the federal level that are all trying to depolarize, trying to bring people together. And then we want to institutionalize that. And you mentioned earlier deliberative democracy, and I want to dig in a little bit in our final part of our discussion about citizens' assemblies or other participatory models. As you know, I'm advocating for emergency state citizens' assemblies to be convened to refresh the Constitution, followed by a national citizens' assembly or a national citizens' convention to ratify a refreshed Constitution. Can you give any perspective on citizens' assemblies and how that could be integrated into our form of government and our legal system, and in all the ways that it builds on everything that you've studied, but it is a deliberative democracy political mechanism that is happening all over the country and all over the world now?
I think that our connection is an illustration of what's possible, because this is something I have to say with all of my research, I didn't really know about this until you and I connected. I know about participatory budgeting.
Yes.
I've both studied and participated in legislative theater, where, started by Francisco Boal, using theater as a process. Theater was originally a political enterprise, as I learned from my friend and colleague Janine Tesori. And as we've developed through the Broadway Advocacy Coalition, which brings together artists and people directly impacted by racism and incarceration and law students and lawyers to reimagine our public discourse about race and democracy. So this has happened where we use sites for decision-making that are not constrained by the formalities of our current political process.
Right.
But that actually define, as it sounds like citizens' assemblies are doing, that define ways of interacting that allow conflict to be constructive. Conflict is important.
Exactly.
Conflict is necessary.
Right.
We are not going to agree on everything. And conflict can produce a new understanding if we actually can listen to each other. And so if we have structures and processes that allow that to happen in real time, we can rethink how do we want to build our more formal processes or rebuild them so that these kinds of conflicts can in fact play out in ways that can produce, if not consensus, at least a mutual respect that allows everyone's interests and needs to be taken into account. And so doing this in a way that is structured to connect across different localities, to do these, I call these fractals in the book, these little mini versions of the larger democracy that we want to see.
Right.
And then doing that in a way that is very deliberate about how do we need to rethink our government institutions so that the bodies that are responsible for making decisions that bind us all become more reflective of the perspectives and the needs of interests who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of and the practitioners of democracy. I think that is one of the most important things that we can be doing. And so I think it's so important also that you and others that you have are not just doing this in real time through these citizens' assemblies, but you're also creating a space for people to learn about this who are not in those citizens' assemblies through your podcast and through this other work.
Yeah.
Because we have to find ways to connect that don't only depend on our existing formal news media, and that can bring people together in ways that can build on each other, which is the movement that I see these citizens' assemblies trying to create.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I agree with you that citizens' assemblies are a part of the civic renewal movement. There's other aspects of citizen engagement and citizen participation that are really critical. You mentioned participatory budgeting as an example of one. And there are there's a lot of exciting work happening in the digitally enabled deliberation space. So there can be virtual citizens' assemblies and virtual deliberations and ways that more and more people can participate. There's deliberative polling that's already taking place in many environments. And so all those innovations now need to be brought to scale is what we're working on. So I thank you for your eloquent explanation of it. Even as a newbie on citizens' assemblies, you got the essence of it deep
Yeah.
in your heart. Yeah.
And I would just say that as someone who does a lot of work with people who have experienced incarceration, who've been really removed from technology, that as we do this, technology is both an enabler of full participation and also a practitioner of
It could be a barrier.
equitable participation. And so we really have to be conscious of that as we are moving in that direction. I see that so powerfully. And then one other thought is that I think workplaces and schools are real sites where some of this kind of participatory democracy can grow. And I think institutions are the places where people experience day-to-day decision-making.
Yeah.
And how do we connect what happens to people in the institutions that define our lives with the political space? I think that's part of the challenge that we face now. Right now, these are two really distinct spaces, and we live in institutions. We work in institutions. We go to school in institutions. We worship in institutions. We purchase in institutions. I could keep going.
Yeah.
So we have to find ways for those institutions to be participatory, and to have that also then inform the way our politics operate.
Yeah, that's well said. You're really at the cutting edge. I mean, there have been Meta, for example, did have an employee assembly, and there is advocacy going on. There was recently an op-ed published by some leading deliberative experts on calling for shareholder assemblies, so that there could be a broader perspective, because the way shareholders operate, it's all controlled by a minority. And so most shareholders don't really have a true voice. So you're right to say that the deliberative participatory practices that we're espousing should penetrate all institutions, and even private sector institutions as well are already experimenting with it at some level. Well, thank you so much. I've learned so much from you, and I appreciate your clarity and your wisdom and your hopefulness. I think you are a revolutionary optimist. I have to just share with you that is my diagnosis of you. And I want you to, let's stay in touch and let's see if our paths can cross again. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I really appreciate what you're doing and the chance to be part of it.
Great. Have a great week.
You too.
What an honor to speak with Professor Susan Sturm from Columbia Law School. She's also the director of the Center for Institutional and Social Change at Columbia. She has a profound analysis of how our institutions have been racialized and how caste systems operate within our government and in our society and in all institutions, private sector, universities, etc., and in the legal and court and criminal justice systems as well. Susan is undoubtedly a revolutionary optimist, as I said. She, despite seeing all the challenges and all the paradoxes, and she offers us a clear language to help understand reality. She offers us pathways forward through individual, local action, and as well as institutional transformation. And even in spite of oppression, we know that this transformation is still happening under the radar. So I want to just thank Susan and encourage her to keep firing on all cylinders to bring forward a vision of healing and transformation and to heal the wounds of racial caste that are still plaguing our society. Thank you, Susan.
Are you ready to be part of the revolution? To learn more about revolutionary optimism, please visit revolutionaryoptimism.com. To get to know Dr. Zeitz, please visit drpaulzeitz.org, and to explore building movements, please visit unifymovements.org. If you like this show, be sure to follow on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. Revolutionary Optimism, transforming the world one episode at a time.